Welcome to the Ask the Geographer podcast series, brought to you by the Education Department at the Royal Geographical Society with IBG. I'm Rachel, your host, and in each episode I'll be joined by geographers from across the globe to delve into current events, publications and research, all tied to the fascinating world of geography. Climate Adapted Pathways in Education, or CAPE, is working to improve today's education for tomorrow's climate. Their vision is to equip teachers and school leaders with the knowledge and skills to help all children and young people take climate action and protect the environment. In this podcast, we are delighted to welcome co-founders Hina Dave and Professor Lee Hoth and geography specialist Michelle Minton. Hina is a PhD student investigating how school leaders approach climate change education. She's worked as a teacher, written professional development for school leaders, and has been a flood warning expert for the Environment Agency. Hina also co-authored Cracking Key Concepts in Secondary Science. Lee is a Professor of Science Education in the School of Education and Childhood at Leeds Trinity University. She has worked with BBC Teach on projects like Blue Planet Live teacher materials and their Regenerators campaign, bringing environmental and climate issues into classrooms. Lee was also a chair of the Association for Science Education, championing how schools can better prepare young people for a changing world. Michelle is an experienced geography teacher and teacher educator. She currently works for Teach First, training our next generation of geography teachers. Michelle is an editor and author of Wide World GCSE Geography magazine and has written articles and resources for the Geographical Association. She volunteers for CAPE as a geography curriculum lead and has a real passion for climate change education. Welcome to the podcast. Hina and Lee, can you tell us your reasons for setting up CAPE?
Yeah, I'll start on that one. So during COP26, Hina and I were up working with some schools in Glasgow. And at that point, the Department for Education dropped their sustainability and climate change draft strategy. And when we looked at it, we thought this is really welcome. It's time that this agenda was really pushed. But what we wanted to do was support schools in thinking about how they would implement the strategy. Because in education, for however many years we've been in it, what we've seen is the latest thing come in. 2 or 3 years down the line, it falls flat on its face because the foundations just aren't strong enough. It's just been straight to delivery. How do we enact this in the classroom? So we had a crazy idea where we pulled together people from all age phases in education, including early years, HE, FE. We pulled in some people from industry and some of third sector organisations as well. And with great support from the Teacher Development Trust and Leeds Trinity University, we produced a report that really focused on creating the foundations for effective implementation. And that was published in 2022. And from there, we started to have some really great working relationships with some big multi-academy trusts. So one of the first ones was Reach 2 Academy Trust. It's got 60 plus primary schools in England. And they really wanted support in how do we make our curriculum better for our children, including climate change education. So we worked with them and then increasing trusts heard about the work that we were doing. And it was really about how can we use the existing curriculum that already meets the needs of the children and young people in those schools? How can that be adapted? And how can we make sure that climate change education is high quality, not just an add-on, not just the same 6 lessons that children encounter across different year groups, but really making sure that there's high levels of subject discipline in there as well. So from there, CAPE it's just grown. We have 8 trusts and federations that we work with, as well as individual schools. We have so many amazing external partners as well. So we work with the National Education Nature Park and the Natural History Museum, the Tate Modern are examples. So we really sort of want to highlight that it's not just Hina and I sitting here. We draw upon the expertise that's needed to really support the implementation of climate change education into schools meaningfully.
And just picking up on what Lee was saying in terms of high quality, what we found as we were starting up CAPE was that there was a real confusion about what evidence-informed climate change education looks like. That's really at one of our core purposes here at CAPE is what does it look like when we really start looking at the evidence? Actually, can we trust some of the evidence? Is some of the evidence perhaps outdated? So we do explore many of these knotty questions. And I think in terms of Lee and I working with school leaders and teachers, what we do find is that there is confusion and conflation around some of the really complex terms. So even if you take climate change and what's the difference between climate change and sustainability, where does nature connection come into this? How do we not confuse climate change education and decarbonisation of the school estate? These are really complex technical things that need to be navigated within a school context. And actually, one of the things that we found is that our work in navigating that with school leaders and subject leaders in particular is really challenging work. And actually what we found is that this isn't something where there is a silver bullet. Actually takes a long-term amount of support for school leaders and teachers as well.
Definitely. One of the ways in which you're helping to build confidence in climate education is through the Climate Wise Schools training programme. Could you tell us a little bit more about this?
Yes, so Climate Wise Schools, again, so it started with a great deal of support from TDT and Leeds Trinity Uni. But what we did was create a professional development programme, because we do know that teachers and school leaders are calling out for professional development in this space. But what they don't want is just a half-day course or something that's short-term. So using particularly Hina's expertise in this area, we created a framework that is based on an MPQ model. So the course lasts about 11 months in total. Predominantly, it's a leadership course. So this is what we're really focusing on: school leaders, subject leaders, people who are really looking to make this deep, meaningful change. So we work with them across these 6 modules to be able to support the implementation of climate change education into their curriculum. Hina, if you want to talk a little bit more about the detail of that.
Yeah, absolutely. So we do take them through quite a rigorous programme of the 11 months, which does involve exploring carbon literacy, what makes a great culture for climate change education, and actually really focusing in on implementation. We have been working with Jonathan Sharples at the Education Endowment Foundation to explore what the pinch points are in terms of implementing climate change education. And that could be lack of knowledge, it could be that there are no resources or time put against climate change education within the curriculum. We also support our school leaders and subject leaders by exploring curriculum and pedagogy and practice. And in particular, one of the things that we find is really challenging for our school and subject leaders is to understand what makes high quality outdoor learning, for example. And so we really start to unpick that alongside working with colleagues at the National Education Nature Park as well. And then we really do hone in on, towards the end of the programme, what great strategic management looks like of climate change education, and we support colleagues with developing their own confidence in delivering professional development. So the 11-month programme is really about developing these in-depth and complex mental models for climate change education that is not built on a tick list of one-off lessons. This is about embedding climate change education across a whole school context.
I think it's probably worth adding as well that, because when we pitch it like that, it sounds quite intense and dull, and it's really not. What we have is a space where actually we've got school leaders, subject leaders, and from all different sectors, age phases coming together, and the space that they have to talk to each other and hear each other is really, really valuable. So one of the things that's been created as a result, we're now in our 3rd cohort of Climate Wise Schools participants, is a real sense of community and being able to then share expertise and share thinking, because everybody's at a different point in this journey, and it's really important that even those who feel that they are really far along, actually when you start to dig down into the practices and what everything is based on in your school, it might be all hinged on that one enthusiastic person. And we see that a lot, don't we, in schools, where you've got somebody who goes, this is my passion, this is what I want to do, I'm going to do all this. And if it's in a primary school and then suddenly I become maths lead and I don't have time to do anything, or I change schools and all of that goes. So what we're really doing is supporting these people and forming a really strong network as well with each other. And that helps because we can say, well, actually, we know this COO in a school who's gone down this route and has worked really well with the curriculum people to be able to then align what's happening in terms of decarbonisation of the estate with feeding into how that can be taught and support the curriculum piece in the school. So there's certainly more to it than just the structure, but it's a course that's out there, a programme that doesn't seem to exist anywhere else, and I think it meets a really particular need of our school leaders and subject leaders.
And I wanted to add to that, Lee, as well, which is it has been really important for us for this programme to be highly evidence informed. So one of the things that we've done front and centre for the programme was really design it around the Education Endowment Foundation's mechanisms for effective professional development. So I think when Lee's talking about this idea of there is definitely a collective body, there's collegiality, there's collaboration, but this really just speaks to the mechanisms, which is around keeping professional development social. It's about keeping our school leaders motivated and highly engaged, because we know that when they are, it is more likely to lead to changes in practice. So I think we know that school leaders and subject leaders are highly busy professionals. They don't have time to waste on professional development. That's not going to have an impact. So one of the things that we could do ethically in CAPE is to make sure that we've really rooted the programme in those mechanisms for professional development.
It sounds that you've achieved a lot so far. Is there anything you want the programme to achieve in the future?
I think there's probably a couple of things. One of the things that we really want to do is to be able to capture the impact of the programme as it has developed. So we evaluate it. We have all those evaluations and we're very honest about those, and they've informed the iterations of the programme. It's overwhelmingly positive, but we know there are things that we can always do better. But one of the things that we really want to do is to explore the impact of the programme as we've had 2 or 3 generations of schools participate. So we've got a school, for example, who's now got its 3rd member of staff coming through the programme. So what that means is actually they're not starting from scratch. They're starting from a point that's further along the line and looking at how that can help support that leadership of climate change education in the school. So that's a longer term issue, because we can't rush in and evaluate long-term impact at the beginning of a programme. That's just, completely unrealistic.
Just to build on what Lee was saying, is this idea perhaps that you go on an afternoon's programme and suddenly your teacher or school leadership practice is going to be totally changed. And we know that that's not the reality in schools, because they're highly complex organisations. So actually, I think in terms of what we hope to achieve, coming back to Lee's point around impact, is around rooting climate-wise schools in a very intentional theory of change that we have at CAPE. What that means is that actually, yes, at the moment, we know that our school leaders are really positive about the programme. We've seen implementation plans created as a result of the programme. And actually, what we want to achieve with this programme in the long term is to be able to really understand how practices have changed for teachers, how curriculum implementation has really impacted children and young people, to try and understand how the knowledge of children and young people has actually developed as a result of this programme. And I think quite often what we see in this space are one-off programmes that don't speak to the equitable climate change education that all children and young people deserve. So I think going back to the root of our mission, that's kind of what we really want to achieve with this programme.
And I think the other thing is we are, for as much as absolutely this is a leadership programme, this is leadership of climate change education, but we are aware that there are the chances of this being the priority in schools is so low. Our children and young people are concerned about the environment, and there's absolutely no doubts about that, but they are also concerned about crime, about illness, they're concerned about poverty. We have children that are walking into school without having had breakfast. They are the real sort of priorities for our teachers during the day. So what we are really supporting are schools taking brave leadership decisions and saying, it's not that I'm going to bring this into the priorities and push the other things away, but in terms of working alongside the reality of being in school, which is really important for supporting our children and young people.
Definitely. Michelle, you've developed the geography-specific materials for CAPE. Please can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. So it might be nice to start at the beginning, really, because I discovered the work of CAPE maybe a couple of years ago now. And the approach that you've just heard Lee and Hina talk about completely inspired me, because I think what is so special about CAPE is that it's an approach to climate change education, which is really empowering. It really looks to support teachers and leaders to develop the expertise so they can then make the right decisions for their own children and their school communities. And hopefully those changes are then more likely to kind of stick and to be more impactful. And so as part of kind of my relationship with CAPE, I've brought in my experience of being a geography teacher. So as you said in the introduction, I've been a geography teacher in Leeds for 12 years, now moved into teacher education, but still definitely keep my finger on the pulse there. And what really spoke to me was recognising the role that unique disciplines have in building that deep and holistic understanding of climate change, and really supporting children and young people to become more proficient in both climate change education, but also in their subjects. So I really believe that climate change education supports students to better understand climate change now and into the future, but also better understands geography and becomes better geographers. And so the guidance I've created is to support primary school teachers and leaders to really think hard about their geography curriculum and how climate change education can be effectively embedded to support the children in their own communities. So the guidance is pretty chunky and I really hope people read it and really appreciate it and really enjoy it, and I'm really looking forward to having some conversations and getting some feedback on that. But I'll take you over a little bit of a summary. But like I say, it's got a lot of content and it's informed by a huge amount of evidence. So I really hope people do take the time to have a read of it when it comes out. Whether you're secondary or primary, I think hopefully you'd find it super useful. So this guidance, it starts by digging into geography as a discipline and really looks to answer questions like, what is geography? Why is geography so important for effective climate change education? What are these key concepts and powerful knowledge in geography that's going to support effective climate change education? And it includes, beyond just the climate science, it also includes concepts around climate justice and thinking about how we can use pupils' personal geographies. It goes on to talk a little bit about what unique disciplinary knowledge we have in geography that can support our students to better understand climate change as well. So it includes things about how we might use geographical inquiry, how we might want to use fieldwork, and how students can do geography and apply that understanding. So how can they recognise that they have agency and empower them to think about changes that they can make that are reasonable within, their lives and their school communities, and the agency they have to influence others, whether that's their local community, whether it's their school or more globally. At the end of that first section of really kind of getting to grips into what geography is and how climate change education fits within the discipline of geography in schools, I share 8 evidence-informed principles that aim to be kind of deeper underlying principles that will really support teachers and leaders to make effective decisions about their own curriculum. So I'll share the 8, and again, always open to kind of feedback of these when people start playing with them, when they're reflecting on their curriculum. So the first one is around building foundational substantive knowledge beyond students' everyday experiences to really prepare pupils to understand the complexity of climate change. The second is about developing that conceptual understanding of place, interconnection, and environment, which are really crucial when we're thinking about high quality geography education. The third is around building geographical skills to be able to interpret and make sense of climate data and opportunities to really work like a geographer through geographical inquiry and fieldwork. The fourth principle is about using the local area and personal stories to really provide children with concrete examples and support them to make that meaningful connection to their own place and to the environment. The fifth is to explore an ethical dimension, so where the children's personal experiences are respected and shared, and also that we represent a diversity of views and values, and we consider alternative perspectives. The sixth is about creating opportunities for agency, capabilities for action, and real hope for the future. The seventh is around appreciating that justice and political dimensions to climate change and implementing an anti-racist and decolonised curricula. I think that's definitely a gap in my experience in schools, particularly. And then finally, to prepare to expose and challenge common misconceptions and stereotypical views that children might hold of places and people, and trying to avoid a single story narrative. So if you read the first section, it gives you all of that background evidence that has informed those 8 principles that I've gone through. And then just briefly, that second part of the guidance really supports teachers and leaders in a more practical sense for how they can think really critically about climate change education, which is currently going on in their schools, how it's going on in Key Stage 1 all the way up to Key Stage 2, thinking about what topics are currently being taught and how perhaps we can really make use of those and use what's in the national curricula, but support our development and our understanding of that by bringing in climate change education. So it provides lots of different kind of practical examples of how we might break down some really big, tricky ideas to make sure that we're thinking from Key Stage 1, how we can begin children's journey and understanding the environment around them, their place, their relationships, and how one impact somewhere can then have multiple different consequences. I'll give you just one example of that if you think that might be useful. So one example might be thinking about children learning about ecosystems and biomes in geography. And so pupils in Key Stage 1 can begin to understand what plants and animals need to survive and why they're so special and so important. And they can begin to consider some key terminology and think a little bit about the actions that we can take to care for and protect plants and animals that are local to us. We then might think about progressing that further to maybe lowest Key Stage 2, where pupils might deepen their knowledge of a specific biome, and particularly we might choose a biome that really relates to our thinking around climate change. So they might zoom into the tropical rainforest, for example. They might learn a bit about the normal characteristics of this biome through specific examples. And that means that later on, they will begin to appreciate how these normal trends of climate has changed over time by giving this concrete understanding perhaps earlier in their schooling. They can start to think about different people's perspective on protecting this biome and start thinking about other actions that we might want to take, and the actions that we can take here in England and can have impacts that are more global. So, for example, like reducing the use of palm oil and things like that. And then when we move to upper Key Stage 2, we can encourage pupils to really deepen their understanding of the processes around photosynthesis and how vegetation really interacts with the atmosphere and the hydrological cycle. So we can bring in some ideas around prevention of flooding and soil erosion, and they might begin to appreciate how one impact can then have multiple knock-on effects. And they can start to perhaps appreciate some traditional Indigenous communities and the knowledge that they have and we can learn on from how to live gently and more sustainably with the environment. And they might even begin to dip their toe into kind of a sense of power in decision making. Who has the power to make decisions about this area? And what role do we have in that decision making? What role maybe do our government have in that decision making? So we can see over kind of a process or a sequence from Key Stage 1 to upper Key Stage 2, a pupil just in ecosystems and biomes, which is in the national curriculum, can really delve and deepen and develop their knowledge and understanding over time. Also, you might have noticed some of those principles that I mentioned coming in there around recognising the local, thinking about multiple impacts, getting some geographical skills in there and the ability to have agency and to take action. So that's kind of part 2. And then it finishes off with a little bit more support and advice around common misconceptions that we might want to look out for and how we can support our curriculum development work in being more representative of people and places, anti-racist, and being much more inclusive. So like I said, it's a chunky document, and you can hopefully see by that summary, believe it or not, that there's a lot packed in there.
Definitely. I think you've given our listeners a lot of food for thought there. Just thinking specifically maybe about a top tip, what would you give your listeners, the kind of a top tip for bringing climate education into both primary and secondary classrooms?
Yeah, thank you. I really thought hard about this question because, like I said, I've been a geography teacher for 12 years and I've had lots of experience teaching climate change to young people. And to be completely transparent and honest, there was lots of things I didn't do and I could have done, and I think it would have made a real impact in terms of my pupils' understanding about climate change and how they could grasp really tricky ideas, really hard ideas for adults to grasp, but also to present it in a way that we can have hope for the future. And so I've come up with 3 top tips for now. There's more in the guidance. I'll keep plugging it away. So the first one is around making it relevant. I think I was really guilty of talking a lot about the impacts of climate change for places very much far away. And it certainly has its place to appreciate and understand this. But we also need to consider where our pupils and school community are based. So, for example, are you in a school that's located on a coastline that's facing erosion and sea level rise? Are you in a lowland area that's recognizing that flooding is increasing in recent years? Like, how can we make it really relevant to our children, making it concrete and tangible so they can begin to understand how climate change could affect them and is affecting them, but also alongside that, thinking about how local communities have the power to adapt and local actions that can be taken to both support adaptation and mitigation. So hopefully support some agency there and some hope for the future. The second tip is around when we discuss the impacts of climate change, being really thoughtful about making it representative. In geography, we can very easily use a location or a place or a group of people as an example. And like one example that might be is only teaching about Bangladesh when we're referring to flooding. And the real danger of that is that our students, our children, have a very single story of place and of people. And so thinking really carefully about being representative of places and of people, using their voices, using their perspectives and stories, but also sharing legacy and climate justice content, and also showing stories of hope and positivity. So there's so many examples of rapid, development happening in Bangladesh and lots of community initiatives to adapt to climate change, but we don't always share those. So thinking really carefully about how we can be representative, I think is really important. And then finally, recognizing that teaching about climate change is really tough for teachers. And it can be really tough for children as well. And I know we'll talk a bit about climate anxiety shortly. So my top tip here is to create that space for children to share both their worries, but also their hopes and their dreams for a brighter future. I'm sure lots of listeners have come across the work of David Alcock, who has been writing a lot about hopeful geographies. And if you haven't, I recommend checking out some of his blogs and his articles. So thinking about how we can support our children to envisage brighter futures and having hope for the future and developing their agency within that is really valuable and really important. But recognising it's not just on them. They haven't got that sole responsibility on their shoulders. It's about what we can do as a collective to work together to kind of build the future that we all want to live in. So my 3 top tips, quite in-depth kind of ones to really hopefully sit with a cup of tea and reflect on and think about when you look back to your curriculum and the lessons that you might be teaching about climate change.
Thank you. And Michelle, you did touch on it about climate anxiety, and that is my next question. It is a growing concern amongst educators and our pupils alike. How do you think we can support our educators in reducing anxiety in the classroom?
We've been really privileged in CAPE to work with a Canadian partner university and a research prof over there, Professor Catherine Mulbuffer-Tobies. And she really is digging into the despair, the challenges, the emotions that children feel around climate change. One of the things that came through the latest research that we have supported, which has been with schools in Yorkshire and in the Midlands, was as teachers, what we want to do is to make things better for our children and young people. What we want to do is when they come to us and say they're worried about something, we want to do that metaphorical cuddle and go, it'll be fine, it'll be okay. And, it's balancing, as Michelle's spoken about, that need for hope and that need for being positive, but actually acknowledging this is not going to be okay if we do not do something about it. So we've worked, and one of the phrases that came through this research was that it's really important that teachers take the time to sit in the darkness of this with our children and young people to say, yeah, do you know what? You're right. We are in a bit of a pickle here with this old world and this climate change that is going on, and acknowledge that those feelings are okay. They are reasonable feelings to have, but actually not rush to that, it will be fine, and giving them that sort of false hope that if we just think it'll be okay, that it will be. So I think it's really important, and that's really tricky, really, really tricky for teachers.
Yeah, just building on that, if I may, is that actually one of the things that we know about climate anxiety is it is another complex educational challenge for teachers and school leaders. And actually, given that, it's really important that we take it really seriously as educators. And just reflecting on what Lee's just said, so for example, our relationship with Bishop's University in Canada is a long-term one. So we're now in the third year of a really long-term research program to try and unpick and understand actually what is happening with climate anxiety or eco-anxiety amongst children, and especially amongst primary children, for example, where we've got very little data. So again, my big plea to school leaders and teachers is to really be aware of the evidence that's out there, that this is a really developing field. We don't know as much as we'd like to think that we know about it. And actually, one of the really difficult things to navigate as a school leader or an educator or a teacher is that actually by not really understanding this, we do risk making things worse sometimes for our children and young people. And this is really unintentional. We don't ever intend to do this, but actually it is really important on this aspect, especially when we know that well-being and mental health for children and young people is so important right now, is that we have to be led by the evidence. And so one of the things that we've done with Bishop's University is to think about, okay, what level of evidence? So we have undertaken randomized control trials to understand what interventions work. And actually what we found was that an intervention of utilizing art and philosophy together really helps children unpack their emotions, communicate about them in different ways, and to be able to talk about them with teachers is really important. And I really think for me, this speaks to our curriculum framework that we have at CAPE, which is wrapped around knowledge being foundational, but then self-regulation of that knowledge becoming absolutely critical, which is then underpinned by collective action. And I think if, as Michelle said, if children are able to work through their feelings and emotions, and if they are really supported to take collective action, then actually these are some of the things that may be protective factors against climate anxiety or eco-anxiety. So I think really seeing this as a complex topic that we're learning more about, and that's also because the impacts of climate change are changing quite rapidly as well. So, this is not a static field. It is something that is developing as our carbon emissions continue to increase.
The only kind of additional, perspective here to add is to think about ourselves as teachers. It could be someone listening to the podcast now that's about to teach a lesson on climate change tomorrow or next week, or to give yourself some space and time to think about how you're going to navigate those discussions in the classroom and work with colleagues. Don't feel like you're on your own to have those reflections. So think a little bit about how you might, at the beginning of the lesson, share that, we're going to talk about climate change. You might have lots of thoughts and feelings about climate change, and I want you to feel comfortable to be able to share them. This is a space where we'll listen to each other and respect each other. But just having that time to think, well, how am I going to set this up to make a classroom environment safe and respectful and comfortable for children to engage in those discussions and feel able to speak with open and honesty about it. And lean on your support networks, whether it's people in school or whether it's like subject communities. Ask how they're doing it and speaking to them about how they've navigated those kind of discussions and the things that have come up in terms of questions and worries in their classroom, so you can work together and not feel like you kind of are going in it and you don't feel prepared. So that's the only thing I'd perhaps offer.
Thank you. And just rounding off, can you please both all give us one important key takeaway message that you'd like our teachers and pupils to reflect on after listening to this today?
For me, I think it's really important that teachers don't rush into this. I know we have talked about the urgency of it, and it's really, really important that we make a move on this very soon. But I think it's about getting the quality of that right. So by slowing this down and thinking about what we are teaching in relation to climate change within the subject discipline and actually treating it with the respect that we would any other subject is really important. So planning in a really coherent way and really thinking about how is my knowledge sequenced in relation to this? What does that look like in geography compared to science or art or any other subject? So really thinking about, actually, let's slow this down. Let's spend the next year planning this and getting it right before we launch into making those changes, because that goes back to that, it falls flat in a couple of years' time where we started this conversation.
For me, I think my key takeaway, but it's really linked to what Lisa has just said, is around really prioritising and understanding what knowledge-rich curriculum looks like. And I think that really comes back to educators' own subject knowledge about climate change. And one of the things that we see in the literature over and over again is the level of misconceptions that children hold about climate change. And actually, teachers must be really confident in their own subject knowledge if they're going to start to support children through climate change education. And one of the things that I want to say is that this is often conflated. Like we often, it's really tempting to say knowledge isn't important in this, and actually it's about the actions that we take instead. But actually where we end up in is a place where children are asked to turn off the lights, but they don't understand why. And actually the purpose of a school is to be able to equip children with knowledge so that they can make decisions and have agency and be empowered. So I think for me is really thinking about what a knowledge-rich curriculum looks like.
And I think my top tip is linked both to what Lee and Hina have just said and maybe something practical that you could do after listening to this podcast is I shared 8 kind of principles, and they are informed by the evidence. So maybe just pick one of them to reflect on your curriculum and what's going on in your lessons, where possibly there could be any gaps. So like having a look, like, do we already do this? Just focusing on one to start with. Where is it? How does this change from, Key Stage 1 to Key Stage 2? Or if in your secondary school, have a look at them. How does it change from Key Stage 3 to Key Stage 4 or 5? Is there capacity to make those tweaks or adaptations to what we already do to just make it that little bit more effective, make it a little bit more holistic and deepen that knowledge and understanding in that area? And if you're not sure which one to choose, I'd recommend maybe starting with how you might be able to use your local area and personal stories to really support students to get some concrete examples and foster that meaningful connection between their own local place and the environment. So yeah, that's what I'd start if you're not sure which of those perhaps to choose, and just have some time maybe in your department or with some colleagues to reflect on what you've got and what one step you could take to begin to adapt and develop what you're teaching and the learning that's happening in your classrooms.
Hina, Lee and Michelle, thank you for sharing your insights on how we can bring climate education into our classrooms and beyond. Today's conversation has given us fresh ideas and inspiration to help young people not only understand climate change, but also feel empowered to take action and help them manage climate anxiety.
Thank you. It was really lovely to do. So thank you so much for inviting us on.
Thank you for tuning in. If you enjoyed this podcast, don't forget to subscribe to the Ask the Geographer podcast series on soundcloud.com or your preferred streaming platform. Dive deeper into the world of geography and stay informed with our wide range of resources, many of which are available for free. School membership grants access to even more resources, including online lectures and supporting materials for both teachers and learners. Explore our resources and discover our additional offers for education at www.rgs.org/schools.